In a silent parliament hall in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed stood before his lawmakers, lifted his eyes, and said a sentence so simple that it nearly went unnoticed. Our economy is growing without foreign loans. No shouting, no applause, no dramatic pause. Just a calm, grounded statement, yet it carried the weight of a century. For decades, Africa has been told that it cannot stand without someone else's hand holding it. That progress must be borrowed, that freedom must be financed, that independence is only valid when approved by the IMF. But that day, Ethiopia broke the script. It wasn't just a political moment, it was a psychological earthquake. Because those 8 words, "our economy is growing without foreign loans," said something far greater that an African nation can finally breathe without permission. It didn't come with thunder or revolution in the streets. It came with a whisper, the kind that changes everything quietly from within. Abiy Ahmed didn't boast. He didn't plead. He spoke like a man who had finally placed both feet on solid ground, his own ground. And across the continent, people listened. From Nairobi to Ouagadougou, from Lagos to Bamako, that whisper turned into a pulse, a heartbeat of dignity rising again. What does it mean when a nation chooses struggle over submission, self-reliance over comfort, sovereignty over dependency? What happens when Africa stops asking and starts deciding? This is not just Ethiopia's story. It's a story of every nation that dares to say no to the easy path and yes to its own destiny. So stay with us, because this isn't about numbers or loans, it's about freedom. And maybe, just maybe, it's about the moment Africa finally remembers who she really is. Please share if you believe dignity matters more than debt. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's quiet revolution has already begun. It began quietly without fireworks or fanfare. No protests, no breaking news, headline just a calm moment inside Ethiopia's parliament when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed stood up and said, "Our economy is growing without foreign loans." To many, it sounded like an ordinary statement about economic growth. But to those who understand Africa's long story of financial dependency, those words were thunder wrapped in silence. They signaled something no one thought possible, a nation choosing dignity over debt. Let's rewind. Around 2019, Ethiopia launched what Abiy Ahmed called the Homegrown Economic Reform Program. It didn't come from a World Bank document or a team of foreign consultants. It came from within, from Ethiopian economists, local business leaders, and policymakers who were tired of their nation being defined by aid. The idea was revolutionary in its simplicity. Build from what we have. Spend what we earn. Grow without begging. For decades, the continent had been caught in a cycle of dependency, borrowing from the same institutions that once dictated its politics and trade. Every loan came with a promise, but also a leash. The aid that built roads and hospitals also built invisible chains. Ethiopia decided to cut them. The first step was brutal honesty. Abiy's government looked at its debt, more than $23 billion owed to international creditors, and admitted, "We can't live like this anymore." Then came the bold part. Instead of asking for another bailout, Ethiopia started paying down its debts, renegotiating the unfair ones, and refusing to take new loans. Most experts predicted disaster. Western analysts warned that without IMF or World Bank injections, Ethiopia's economy would collapse within months. Too risky, they said, too ambitious. Yet the collapse never came. By 2025, the results were undeniable. Ethiopia had cut its foreign debt by more than 80%, reducing it from $23 billion to just $4.5 billion. At the same time, its national income rose from 170 billion birr, about $2.9 billion, to nearly 1 trillion birr, around 17.3 billion. That's almost a 5-fold increase achieved without a single new foreign loan. But numbers alone don't tell the story. This was never just about money. It was about mindset. Ethiopia's government began collecting taxes more fairly, investing in domestic industries like agriculture, textiles, and technology, and prioritizing production over dependence. Factories reopened, farmers gained access to local credit, and entrepreneurs began to dream again, not of aid grants, but of exports. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy. Many citizens struggled as subsidies were restructured, and the government took a hard line on corruption. Inflation bit into household budgets, and the temptation to borrow was always there. But Ethiopia held its line. Abiy Ahmed and his team kept repeating one phrase: "We must grow on what we have." That simple sentence became a national mantra, printed on banners, whispered in classrooms, repeated in cafes. It wasn't arrogance, It was faith that a nation could finally trust itself. And slowly it worked. Ethiopia's reforms began to bear fruit. The government restructured local industries, encouraged domestic savings, and even funded major infrastructure projects without relying on Western financing. The result wasn't overnight success. It was slow, patient transformation. International observers began to take notice. In financial centers from Washington to Paris, economists started asking the same uneasy question: how did they pull this off? The truth is, Ethiopia didn't perform magic. It simply refused to play by rules designed to keep it small. By saying no to easy money, it said yes to independence. It reminded Africa and the world that sovereignty isn't only political, it's economic. And that's what makes this story remarkable. Ethiopia didn't overthrow a government or win a war. It overthrew a mindset. It challenged the idea that growth in Africa must be borrowed, that prosperity must be supervised. In a quiet way, this was the beginning of something larger than Ethiopia itself. Because once a nation proves it can rise without help, it changes the way others see what's possible. From Nairobi to Bamako, from Accra to Ouagadougou, leaders began to watch closely. And for the first time in a long time, Africa wasn't following a Western model, it was creating its own. A new rhythm had started to echo across the continent. It whispered, Africa doesn't owe anyone anymore. The shock didn't come from what Ethiopia said, it came from what the world heard. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed quietly declared that his nation's economy was growing without foreign loans, Western institutions didn't clap, they froze. Within days, headlines began to appear in financial circles: Ethiopia's risk level increases, unsustainable independence, concerns over economic isolation. That word concern became the polite code for panic. Because make no mistake, what worried the world wasn't Ethiopia's potential failure, it was Ethiopia's potential success. For decades, the rules of global finance were clear. Africa was the student, the West was the teacher. The IMF and the World Bank set the syllabus, budgets, reforms targets, and African governments followed year after year, generation after generation. The relationship wasn't based on equality, it was based on obedience. Loans came with lectures, and every aid package arrived with fine print that no one in Addis Ababa, Accra, or Ouagadougou was supposed to question. But suddenly, Ethiopia stepped outside that classroom. It didn't shout or rebel, it simply walked away and kept walking. That's what made the West nervous. Because when one student leaves and still passes the exam, the others start wondering if the teacher was ever necessary. Ethiopia's quiet defiance began to spread like an idea you can't unhear. Governments across Africa, from Ghana to Kenya, started asking uncomfortable questions. If Ethiopia can survive without loans, what about us? To the old financial order, that question was dangerous. Because Africa's dependence wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For half a century, aid had been the leash that kept nations manageable. It wasn't just about interest rates, it was about influence, about control. The IMF and World Bank have always presented themselves as helpers. They smile, they offer funds for development, for stability, for reforms. But every dollar carried invisible ink conditions that shaped policies, dictated priorities, even controlled elections. The aid that built roads also built boundaries. Don't nationalize, don't trade too freely, don't grow too fast without permission. So when Ethiopia said, "We're fine, thanks," it wasn't just a policy shift. It was an act of rebellion. A silent revolution written in spreadsheets instead of slogans. Western analysts mocked it at first. They're naive, they said. They'll be back to us within a year. But the months passed. Ethiopia kept growing. The debt kept shrinking. Inflation slowed. Agricultural exports stabilized. Abiy Ahmed didn't gloat. He simply worked while the world talked. Soon other countries began to notice the double standards. When Europe borrows from China, it's called strategic diversification. When Africa does the same, it's called geopolitical risk. When America funds its deficits with trillions, it's called economic stimulus. When Africa takes control of its own currency, it's called instability. You see the pattern. The problem was never the math, it was the mindset. And that's why Ethiopia's story matters so much. Because by succeeding quietly, it exposed the hypocrisy loudly. It revealed that Africa's so-called weakness wasn't natural, it was manufactured. A continent rich in resources, talent, and spirit had been convinced it couldn't breathe without foreign permission. Now Ethiopia was breathing deeply, freely, defiantly. In Washington and Brussels, policy papers started circulating behind closed doors, warning of African financial nationalism. But in Addis Ababa, something entirely different was happening: pride. For the first time in a generation, people felt that their government was standing on its own feet. They saw hope in the silence. This was no noisy protest. It was the kind of revolution that happens when a nation simply decides to stop kneeling. Across Africa, ordinary citizens began talking about Ethiopia in cafes and markets. It wasn't just admiration, it was reflection. "Maybe we can do that too," they whispered. And that whisper, that dangerous, hopeful whisper, began to echo across the continent. Because the truth is, when one African nation proves that freedom doesn't require permission, the rest of the world begins to tremble. So yes, Ethiopia's success made people uncomfortable, not because it threatened global stability, but because it threatened global hierarchy. It was no longer a story of aid. It was a story of awakening, a story that said, the era of dependence is ending. The era of dignity has begun. Behind the statistics and speeches, there were people, millions of Ethiopians, living the quiet consequences of a bold decision. Because freedom, as history reminds us, is never free. When Ethiopia began to cut its foreign debt and reject new loans, it wasn't just a financial experiment. It was a social test of endurance. Prices rose, salaries stretched thin, and patience was often tested. For ordinary citizens, the reforms didn't look like progress. They looked like sacrifice. In the streets of Addis Ababa, families tightened their budgets. Teachers walked long distances when bus fares doubled. Farmers waited for fertilizer while the government restructured subsidies. Parents watched the cost of bread rise and wondered if this debt-free future would ever feed their children. But something remarkable happened. People didn't revolt. They endured. Because for once they saw a government that wasn't selling them for survival. Abiy Ahmed's administration didn't hide the hardship, it explained it. Officials went on air to tell citizens that this was a necessary pain that Ethiopia was building from within. And slowly, trust began to return, that rarest currency in African politics. The government redirected its limited funds towards subsidies worth 440 billion birr, about $7.6 billion, for fuel, fertilizers, school meals, and public salaries. Not to please donors, not to check IMF boxes, but to protect its people during transition. "We can reform," Abiy said, "without abandoning our citizens." That, more than any spreadsheet, was what changed the spirit of Ethiopia. Because for the first time in decades, the people felt that reform wasn't being done to them, it was being done for them. This shift wasn't just economic, it was moral. Ethiopia had decided that sovereignty wasn't worth much if it didn't feed the people who defended it. The ripple effects were political too. Across the continent, citizens in other nations began questioning their leaders' loyalties. In Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, social media threads erupted with comparisons. Why can Ethiopia cut its debt, but we can't? Why do our presidents still beg in Washington? In a way, Ethiopia's reforms didn't just rewrite its own story, they rewrote the expectations of what African leadership could look like. The reform also reshaped the meaning of patriotism. It wasn't about waving flags or chanting slogans. It was about responsibility, the shared burden of rebuilding without shortcuts. Ordinary Ethiopians began to take pride in that. They saw themselves not as victims of poverty, but as participants in progress. This is where the story gets deeply human, because when you talk to people in Addis today, they don't describe their country's transformation with excitement or triumph. They describe it with calm faith. A shopkeeper says, "It's still hard, but at least it's our hardship." A farmer adds, "We've waited before. We can wait again." A teacher smiles, "The government is finally walking with us, not above us." Those aren't the words of desperation. They're the language of ownership. And that's what makes Ethiopia's revolution so profound. It's not driven by noise, but by patience. The people are no longer waiting for someone else to rescue them. They are rescuing themselves. In that sense, this transformation echoes Ethiopia's own history. This is the same land that defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa, proving that Africa could defend its freedom militarily. Now, more than a century later, it's doing the same thing, economically defeating dependency without firing a single shot. It's the rebirth of that Adwa spirit translated into policy, lived out in patience, and carried by ordinary citizens who refuse to bow to the weight of borrowed promises. So yes, the costs were real, but so was the pride. And somewhere between those two, between pain and progress, Ethiopia found something far more valuable than money. It found itself. From the glass towers of Washington, D.C., to the quiet offices of Brussels, something shifted the moment Ethiopia stopped borrowing. Economists who once praised African resilience now began using words like risk instability and non-alignment. In truth, it wasn't the numbers that alarmed them, it was the message. If Ethiopia could grow without debt, what stopped others from doing the same? If one African nation could reject the script written by Western lenders, who would still need the IMF's permission slips? Inside the U.S., policymakers quietly debated Ethiopia's trajectory. For decades, America's influence in Africa had relied not only on diplomacy or aid, but on financial leverage, the power to approve or withhold credit. The Ethiopian model threatened that leverage. It suggested that sovereignty and self-reliance were contagious ideas capable of spreading faster than any loan package. Think tanks began releasing concerned analyses, warning that Addis Ababa was drifting toward economic nationalism. Translation: Ethiopia was no longer predictable. Meanwhile, on African soil, something different was happening. Leaders from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, the new ETS alliance, praised Ethiopia's courage. They saw a mirror of their own struggles, the desire to break free from dependency and reclaim economic sovereignty. A nation cannot call itself free if its budget is approved in another capital, one Malian minister remarked. Across Latin America and Asia, too, the sentiment resonated. Commentators compared Abiy Ahmed's reforms to earlier independence movements, but this time the battlefield wasn't colonial borders, it was balance sheets. Western media framed Ethiopia's stand as risky isolation. Yet the irony was glaring. The same voices that applauded the United States for protecting its own industries now condemned Ethiopia for doing the same. When Washington subsidized farmers, it was called stability. When Addis Ababa did, it was labeled protectionism. But Ethiopia didn't flinch. It knew what many African nations are only now rediscovering, that economic sovereignty is the final stage of political independence. Abiy Ahmed's administration wasn't chasing Western approval, it was building African credibility. For the United States, this posed a deeper question, not about Ethiopia alone, but about the future of influence. For decades, aid and loans were instruments of diplomacy. They bought goodwill, loyalty, and alignment. But how do you influence a nation that no longer needs your money? This is where the silence from Washington speaks volumes. Officials offered polite congratulations on Ethiopia's progress, but behind the scenes they worried. Because if Ethiopia's debt-free model worked, it could redefine the global order of development, where the teacher no longer teaches and the student no longer asks for permission. In Europe, too quiet unease grew. The French and British press warned of a shifting Africa, one where old partnerships were losing their moral weight. In financial capitals, investors recalculated their strategies, realizing that the continent they once viewed as dependent was learning to dictate its own terms. But perhaps the most striking reaction came not from politicians, but from scholars and citizens worldwide. Economists in South America began studying Ethiopia's fiscal discipline as a potential blueprint for post-IMF economies. Activists in the Caribbean and the Middle East cited it as proof that liberation today isn't fought with guns, but with budget sheets, patience, and courage. So yes, the world noticed. Some in fear, others in awe. Because Ethiopia's quiet success didn't just balance its books, it unbalanced the global narrative. And somewhere in the middle of all those think tank memos and nervous board meetings, one truth began to take shape. The era of borrowed pride is over. The era of earned sovereignty has begun. In the end, Ethiopia didn't march, didn't riot, didn't revolt. It simply said no. No to the lenders. No to dependency disguised as help. No to the idea that freedom must come with an invoice. And that quiet refusal changed everything. Because Ethiopia didn't just pay off its debt, it paid off a psychological burden that had haunted an entire continent for generations. The ghost of dependency, the polite colonialism of loans, aid, and conditional generosity was finally being exorcised. This is what many in the West still don't understand. Africa's struggle today isn't about independence, it's about dignity. Political flags were raised long ago, but economic sovereignty, the right to control one's future without permission, has always been the unfinished chapter. Ethiopia has just turned that page. Of course, the journey isn't over. The road ahead remains rough. Inflation bites. Youth unemployment persists. There will be setbacks and stumbles, but none of that erases what has been achieved, a shift in mindset, a revolution of perspective. Because now, for the first time in modern history, one African leader has shown that a country can stand tall without being propped up. And that message travels further than any aid convoy. It echoes through the Sahel, where young officers in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger are fighting their own battles for sovereignty. It echoes in classrooms in Accra, in markets in Nairobi, in the minds of young Africans who are tired of waiting for permission to dream. And it echoes here too for anyone watching from the West, wondering what this new Africa means for them. It means the world is changing. The balance of dignity is shifting. Africa no longer wants sympathy, it wants respect. So perhaps the question is no longer, can Africa survive without help? Perhaps the real question is, can the world survive an Africa that no longer needs saving? Because that's what Ethiopia's whisper has become, a warning, a reminder that global power isn't eternal, and that those who were once taught to borrow are now teaching themselves to build. And maybe, just maybe, this is what the great African thinkers like Thomas Sankara, Kwame Nkrumah, and Julius Nyerere dreamed of: not aid, not pity, but equality. So if you believe that dignity matters more than debt, that sovereignty is worth the struggle, and that Africa's quiet revolution deserves to be seen, don't scroll away. Share this story. Speak about it. Subscribe if you believe that truth should travel further than propaganda. Because sometimes history doesn't shout, sometimes it whispers, and those who listen change the world.